Highbridge, a division of Recorded Books, presents The Lives of Isaac Stern by David Schoenbaum, read by Tom Perkins. I hug to my heart an instrument whose incompleteness is that of the human voice. It has made of me a gregarious musician, finding satisfaction in the company of my fellows, than which no better fate can befall any man, who is not a born cynic, during the brief term of his terrestrial existence. Walter Wilson Cobbett, Cobbett's Cyclopedic Survey of Chamber Music, Volume 2. Preface. A simple fact emerges for me, Robert Bine, the late Chicago violin dealer, pointed out to me some years ago. Violins and violinists are very damned interesting. I didn't need much persuading, but I thought the elegance and economy of what he said, and how he said it, were worthy of a bumper sticker or T-shirt. It also puzzled me that what was so obvious to us seemed a well-kept secret to friends, family, and my historian colleagues. As it happened, I was engaged at the time in a project intended to make his point in what became a book of something over 700 pages, back notes and a wonderful index included. Off and on, it required extended absence from home, got me to St. Petersburg, Tokyo, Shanghai, and took the better part of 20 years to write. It was a few years more before I realized how much time and how many Canadian trees I might have spared had I only learned earlier what I now learned almost by coincidence. The first coincidence was the publication of a short biography of Barbra Streisand in an academic series on notable Jewish lives. The second was my inadvertent discovery that Isaac Stern had left 140 boxes, some 200 linear feet, of personal papers to the Library of Congress. First, if anyone qualified as a notable Jewish life, I told myself, it was Stern. If anyone was born to show and tell what makes violins and violinists very damned interesting, it was also Stern. Second, I now lived about 40 minutes from the library, a generic commute on the Washington Metro. There they were, all under one roof, performing arts, still photos, motion pictures, manuscripts, law library, and current periodicals included. It was the closest I'd ever got in 52 years as an archival researcher to one-stop shopping. For the next 9 months, the Performing Arts Reading Room would be my home away from home. In fact, as I would soon learn, Stern had lived not one notable Jewish life, he'd lived 4 of them, consecutively and concurrently, as immigrant kid, world-class professional, public citizen, and go-to guy in a startling variety of ways for a startling variety of causes and people. Material was a problem, but not because there was too little of it. On the contrary, there was more than enough. The problem in library language was that the papers were unprocessed, meaning that the contents of each of those 140 boxes came as a surprise. It is devoutly to be hoped that a bibliographer will one day catalog what is potentially a major research collection. In the meanwhile, I was working, in effect, in an extraordinarily interesting landfill. The names alone that I found there set me on my ear. But so did random items. One of my favorites was a giant desk calendar that doubled as a daily diet and calorie log. It began, of course, on January 1st. The entries ended on January 2nd. There were also 18 invitations to the White House and instructions from Sir Isaiah Berlin on how to reply to a thank-you note from the Prince of Wales after a 1985 concert in London. The first option was no reply at all, which Berlin suspected would not even be noticed. The second was the full potent manner, that is, "It was so kind of you, Your Royal Highness, to have sent me so moving an acknowledgment of the service which I was deeply honored to lay at Your Royal Highness's feet." The third possibility was a perfectly natural note with the option to add, "If you wish to, that you much enjoyed your conversation with him after the concert, whether you did or not." But after a dozen or so boxes, I noticed a couple of subtexts that extended through the whole collection. It's these that seem to me most interesting today in a world already quite different from the one he left in 2001. The first was the significance of time and place. Without the talent, temperament, brains, and stamina that most of us can barely imagine, Stern wouldn't have been Stern. But he also enjoyed an uncommonly, even uniquely good time to be an American, as well as an historically good place to be a Jew. His luck began at age 10 months, when he got to the United States 3 years before Congress slammed the golden door on open immigration. He grew up in a city with a musical infrastructure and social support system as good as any in Europe. Why go to Europe? Europe came to him. Even in the Depression and war years there was an established concert circuit, network radio included. By his early 20s he'd lucked into a relationship with Sol Hurok, a manager as talented as himself, and played the Carnegie Hall recital that got him to the major leagues. He then lucked into full employment, post-war prosperity, the GI Bill, a bumper crop of university concert series for a bumper crop of first-time college students, and even Hollywood. Post-war superpower was another comparative advantage for American artists. Washington wanted the world to know that there was more to America than money, chewing gum, and cowboy movies. Ambassadors begged Stern to visit. Foreign impresarios and summer festivals couldn't get enough of him. Technology was a multiplier, too. Propeller-driven, then jet-propelled air travel got him in hours to places that Fritz Kreisler and Maud Powell could only reach in days. The coming of the LP record made it possible for its buyers to hear him play uninterrupted movements, even whole concertos and sonatas, in the comfort of home or dorm room. The second subtext came to me incrementally as I continued on my way. What I was looking at, I realized, were Stern's answers to the questions attributed to Hillel in one of the most famous of all non-biblical texts. If I am not for myself, who will be for me? If I am only for myself, what am I? And if not now, when? The first question was no problem. He himself declared in his memoir that his contemporaries, Jascha Heifetz, David Oistrakh, Nathan Milstein, his protégés, Itzhak Perlman and Pinka Zuckerman, and the follow-on generation, Anne-Sophie Mutter, Gideon Kramer, and Midori, all played better than he did. That needn't be taken literally. When he was good, he was very, very good. But it was true, especially as he grew older, that some nights were better than others. He could also be self-ironic, for example about eating and talking, two of his favorite activities. First man: I heard Isaac Stern last night. Second man: what did he say? He told the joke himself. From early on, self-assurance was never an issue. The second question was no problem either. The man who saved Carnegie Hall was not a man who was in it only for himself, nor was the man who put a newly independent third-world Israel on the first-world map, loaned instruments to needy young players, and replied personally and without condescension to a fifth-grader in Oregon who wanted to know what Stern's life was like. The third question was again no problem. With the Internet still beyond the horizon, weeks might pass before he returned to what was waiting for him in New York. But in principle, when almost always meant now. No one, including himself, claimed that he was a tzaddik, a righteous person at the highest level, let alone a Mr. Rogers. Even younger colleagues who venerated him called him a bulldozer. Norman Lebrecht, the British critic, considered him an old-fashioned macher, a person who knows how to get things done and gets them done. There was certainly something to this. But he was also a great violinist, unfailingly respectful of his art and profession, good to his secretaries, attentive to his kids, loyal to his friends, supportive of the young, and an exemplary citizen. Anyone still curious to know how and why violins and violinists are worth writing about need go no further than the Performing Arts Reading Room of the Library of Congress and start with Box 1. The Lives of Isaac Stern. 1. Immigrant. I led a double life, in public, in private. I want to lead it again. I'm not going to deny it. I'm just like you. It's true, you know. Ask yourself, are you ready to go? You want a double lifetime. Double Lifetime, Loudon Wainwright III. Over a long and active career in an era still untouched by social media and the smartphone, the violinist Isaac Stern filled at least 3 Rolodexes, 1 color-coded, and an address book he carried on his person. There were also separate books for London, Paris, and Israel. Like the 2,065 entries in Don Giovanni's catalog, the entries in his address books could be of any age, shape, or social status. As early as 1952, celebrated composition teacher Nadia Boulanger and the Israel Philharmonic knew where to turn for help when the violinist Jean Pasquier fell and smashed his instrument, and the orchestra needed a vacuum cleaner for its guest house. A fan letter from an admirer in Switzerland, addressed to Mr. Isaac Stern, the violinist, New York, USA, arrived with no apparent problem. So did another in Italian from a Taiwanese soprano in Texas, addressed to Dear Dr. Violinist Isaac Stern, by Tether Opera Metropolitan, Manhattan Zone, New York City, United States of America. A few decades and a few lives later, the Lotos Club, a New York literary society whose membership dated back to Mark Twain, Gilbert and Sullivan, and Andrew Carnegie, was happy to co-opt Stern as a member. So was Washington's Alfalfa Club, host to an annual 4-hour dinner for presidents and aspiring presidents with music by the U.S. Marine Band. At Bohemian Grove, a summer camp for the most interesting people in the world, as one enthusiast described it, he shared a tent with Secretary of State James Baker. Before and since, there has never been a career quite like Stern's. Yosef Joachim's is the closest match. Like Stern, Joachim was an upward mobility kid from an unassuming Jewish family who made it in the big city in the world. Born in 1831 on the Hungarian side of the Austro-Hungarian border, he grew up to be a dedicatee of the Brahms and Dvorak concertos and founder of the Berlin Conservatory. His annual quartet series was not only a musical but a civic and social occasion. Season tickets, like furniture, were passed on like heirlooms. Facebook friends, had they existed, might have included Field Marshal Helmut von Moltke, the hero of the Franco-Prussian War, Max Planck, the Nobel Prize physicist, and Arthur James Balfour, the British Prime Minister and Foreign Secretary. In 1907, 5 wagons of floral tributes and carriages as far as the eye could see escorted him to the cemetery. Like Stern's, Joachim's death qualified as news fit to print in the New York Times. It even qualified for an editorial. But none connected as widely, regularly, and easily as Stern with the great, the good and not so good, the rich, powerful, famous and just folks over years, decades, and every continent but Antarctica. Among the papers at the Library of Congress are 18 invitations to the White House, extending from the Kennedy years to the Clinton administration. There are also exchanges with Jack Benny, the iconic comedian, Gregory Peck, the pole star of his Hollywood generation, Maya Plisitskaya, who was to the ballet what Stern was to the violin, with Abe Saperstein of the Harlem Globetrotters and Sir Isaiah Berlin of The Hedgehog and the Fox, with Henry Kissinger, the Harvard conservative turned Secretary of State, as well as Daniel Patrick Moynihan, the Harvard liberal turned Democratic senator from New York, with Edward Said, the prophet of Palestinian nationalism, as well as Golda Meir, the pioneer Zionist, who had once denied that Palestinians existed. There is a spontaneously jolly performance of Auld Lang Syne on NBC's Today Show with William F. Buckley, whose politics could not have been more distant from Stern's if they had been Aaron Burr and Alexander Hamilton. There is a faux solemn exchange in Buckley's National Review with Robert Bork, the conservative jurist whose Supreme Court nomination was shot down by Senate liberals, on how to make the perfect martini. Fellow San Franciscans Tony Bennett and Joe DiMaggio are represented too. But there are also congratulations from one violinist to another for Leo Kaczynski on his retirement after 52 years as conductor of the Sioux City Symphony, and 5 grandfatherly paragraphs for an 8-year-old in Georgia who inherited his quarter-size violin from his brother, wondered whether Stern knew the song Humoresque, that he'd tried with mixed success to play himself, and signed F.V. for future violinist. Anniversary calls to friends, wherever they could be reached by phone, were an endearing habit. Philip Setzer of the Emerson Quartet remembered how Stern called to play Happy Birthday on one of his 2 Guarneri del Jesus, while Setzer was having dinner with friends and colleagues at Chez André in Paris. A grateful doctor in Seattle got the instrument wrong, but not the gesture. The greatest moment at our 50th wedding anniversary occurred when the telephone rang and you played a serenade to Thelma on your Stradivarius, he reported. The governor, the president of the university, and a U.S. senator had even been witnesses, he added. He remembered his friends was an easily imaginable epitaph. So was he answered his mail, though it often took him a few weeks to get to it. We can only regret that he didn't cross lives with Loudon Wainwright III, the songwriter, folk singer, humorist, and actor. For anyone who knew either, it could not only be reasonably assumed that they would find plenty to talk about. They might also have fantasized about how Woody Allen or Nichols and May might turn their conversation into a movie scene. As a man whose aptitude for life was matched only by his appetite for it, Stern would most probably have gone straight to the point. Why only 2 lives, he would have asked. He himself not only favored at least 4, he also managed to live them, not even counting a family and private life that included 3 marriages and as many children. Public and private, each life for the most part followed from the preceding one. But in many ways, as one life spilled into another in a daily cascade of mail, phone calls, appeals, reminders, meetings, memos, committee reports, interviews, rehearsals, and social engagements, they were concurrent as well as consecutive. A representative to-do list for a couple of weeks in 1988 could be extended in principle at least as far back as the 1960s and as far into the future as 2001, the year he died. There was a call from Leonard Bernstein's office about a letter expressing concern for Israeli unconcern for U.S. peace proposals. There was another from Charlotte Gilbert, director of the Visitors Center at the New York Stock Exchange, who wanted to talk about a visit. Agnes DeMille, the dancer and choreographer, hoped Stern could attend her next premiere. Kay Unger of the Jerusalem Foundation wanted him at a birthday tribute for Teddy Kollek, Jerusalem's redoubtable mayor. The Lotos Club hoped he would celebrate the 50th birthday of Maxim Shostakovich, the composer's son. Someone connected to cellist Gregor Pitiagorsky, possibly the pianist Irina Nuzova, thanked him for arranging an appointment with Oscar de la Renta, the fashion designer. Etienne Vatelot, the violin dealer, called from Paris to chat. Galina Vishnevskaya, the wife of Mstislav Rostropovich, called from Paris to request phone numbers where Stern could be reached in Minneapolis and Detroit. Frank Hodsell, chairman of the National Endowment for the Arts, wanted Stern in Washington for a press conference on Capitol Hill. Visiting interviewers were regularly surprised to find him simultaneously practicing, taking phone calls, and watching a ball game on TV, admittedly with the sound off. Friends, colleagues, and the secretarial staff were used to it. He'd fended off some 20 wannabe biographers over the years, he explained to an audience at Washington's Temple Sinai, where Politics and Prose, Washington's signature bookstore, had brought him to promote his newly published memoir. He had nothing to say, he told them, and still had too much to do. In part it was his way of saying no, his version of Penelope's knitting. But it was not entirely disingenuous. Little in his schedule, calendar, or temperament suggested that he spent a lot of time looking in the rearview mirror. He was too busy living. Have already refused 20 to 30 ghosting requests, he scrawled in a note to his secretary in 1990 on how to reply to the latest inquiry. Will first have to start taping thoughts at random. But another decade would pass, and he was approaching 80 before he allowed Robert Gottlieb, New York's most celebrated literary editor, to connect him with the novelist Chaim Potok. The product, a collaborative memoir stitched together from hours of taped interviews, inevitably caused him to remember a lot of people and incidents long forgotten, he told a questioner who was curious about the experience. It also caused him to reflect on things he might have done differently or better. In 1981, Nathan Pritikin, a pioneer nutritionist with a particular interest in cardiovascular health, diabetics, and weight control, advised Stern with exemplary tact that his continuing health is of supreme importance to millions of music lovers, and invited him for a 26-day stay at his longevity center in Santa Monica. If only he could work it into his schedule, Stern replied, but he would try to work in a visit the next time he appeared at the Hollywood Bowl. In a 1985 New Year's greeting, another fan, this time a doctor in San Angelo, Texas, sounded the same trumpet. Free medical advice was not always welcome, the doctor noted preemptively, but Stern needed to lose more weight. He preferred to see Stern on TV and hear his records at 90, then gone and forgotten at 65, the doctor said. A homespun Gilbert with no apparent need of a Sullivan, he even attached a patter song. Now, if it is your waistline that you wish to confine, check your calories, which should be reduced down the line. And on it went before tailing off in a firm recommendation to lay off alcohol and tobacco and add a brisk daily walk. Stern thanked him through his secretary for the verse as well as advice he intended to take seriously, and continued to enjoy his wines and cigars. In 1987, Alexander Schneider, his senior by 12 years and a friend since Stern was a teenager, tried to slow him down. The most important thing is your health, and I really hope you won't start your usual specialitet mishigasses running for what? He urged in the inspired linguistic bouillabaisse he served with the same gusto that Stern brought to multitasking. You have enough kopiken to stop, enjoy life, and play only good music, he added. Let all the chutzpahniks run and make dollars playing all the time fortissimo or pianissimo and lots of vibratissimo. The conductor George Zell once told me that if I hadn't spent so much time doing other things and had just practiced more, I could have been the greatest violinist in the world, Stern acknowledged in his memoir. But if he'd limited his life to music and performance, the next concert, the next tour, he added, I would sooner or later climb the walls. He lived like he was immortal, a grandson recalled. He didn't quite follow conventions or normal practices, and I think the idea of an autobiography or memoir suggested the idea that his life was coming to an end. In fact, it was. His passing, after a last and strenuous appearance in Japan and his second major heart surgery in a year, was again news fit to print far beyond the New York Times. Those his son had shone upon, and there were many, those on whom it had not, and wanted it known, volleyed and thundered during and after his life about his art and character. But no one questioned that he'd come a long way and covered a lot of ground in his 81 years. No one questioned either that his story was emblematic of what Henry Luce had declared the American century as far back as 1941. Like countless American stories, this story began with immigration. Like countless Jewish stories, it also began in Eastern Europe. Known after World War I by its Polish name, Kremenich was a border town at the junction of Poland, Russia, Ukraine, and Belarus. But its historical names alone, Bulgarian, Czech, Slovak, Macedonian, Serbian, German, Russian, Polish, Ukrainian, testified to an eventful history. In the 13th century, it flourished briefly as a commercial center with resident populations of Germans, Poles, Armenians, and Jews, imported for their artisanal skills and merchant connections. But one thing led to another, including Mongols, Lithuanians, Poles, and Cossacks. Between the 16th and 18th century, Kremenica was known as an art and publishing center. Then came the partition of Poland and the Russians, and so it remained till World War I again reshuffled the cards. In 1919, the Paris peacemakers agreed to re-establish Poland, with Kremenica as part of the package. But especially for Jews, the re-establishment of Poland did not mean the coming of peace. A documented presence since the 15th century, the Jews of Kremenica had known good days and bad. In 1522, 240 Jews constituted some 10% of the population. After World War I, some 6,500 constituted about a third. The 16th century was prosperous, the 17th a disaster as Cossacks rebelled against Polish rule, followed by the Russian-Swedish wars against Poland-Lithuania that left a trail of collateral damage. A diminished community recovered, found a niche in cobbling, carpentry, and paper-making, grew accustomed to living in Russia, and even discovered the so-called Jewish Enlightenment. Again in Poland, as Russia imploded in revolution and civil war, they now found themselves the target of Ukrainian pogroms and a reconstituted Poland's systemic anti-Semitism. In the years that followed, an estimated 80,000 from the general area took off for Canada, Latin America, and the United States. Among them were Solomon Stern, about 30, his wife Clara, née Jaffe, 23, and the infant Isaac, just approaching his 10th month. The family was already well on the way to the modern world. Russian in culture and a representative of the intelligentsia by the modest standards of Kremenica, his father was a dashing young man and aspiring artist who posed for a photo in high boots and an open silk shirt with a little beard, a paintbrush, and an easel. His mother had studied singing on a conservatory scholarship in St. Petersburg. 50 years later, when Hollywood turned to Sholem Aleichem, their son was the inevitable candidate to fiddle on the cinematic roof. But the Sterns were as remote from shtetl life as most of the movie's audience. While details were fuzzy, Stern inferred in conversation with Potok that the family had somehow left via Siberia and made their way to San Francisco, where his mother had an elder brother. At least notionally, the new Colossus, who lifted her lamp beside the Golden Door in the harbor of New York, also lifted her lamp beside San Francisco's Golden Gate. It was now 1921, the year Buddy DeSilva and Joseph Meyer introduced California Here I Come in a Broadway musical that starred Al Jolson. 3 years later, Jolson would record it, unforgettably, for Brunswick. The California to which the Sterns were coming could hardly be less like the tortured and tangled world they were coming from. But California, here they came. The immigrant experience would remain a source of pride, even a cornerstone of his identity all his life. While on tour in 1973, he fired off a fan letter to Alastair Cook, host of America, A Personal History, a 13-part BBC series on the evolution of the United States, melting pot and huddled masses naturally included. The salutation, "Dear Mr. Cook," was incidentally a rare indication that the addressee was one of the few somebodies that Stern, who seemed to know everybody, didn't know. "I was with friends in a New Haven hotel room preparing to go to one of the inevitable after-concert parties," he wrote. "We were all so taken that we stayed for the entire hour, letting the hosts wait, but happy for having seen something quite special." In 1996, Stern, the fan, even found occasion to support recent newcomers actively. Upset by recent laws restricting public assistance to legal immigrants and blocking school and hospital access to undocumented immigrant children, New York's Mayor Rudolph Giuliani recruited 25 role models for a media event on Ellis Island, where the mayor would present them as his immigrant coalition in a campaign to educate Congress and the president. As might be expected, Stern accepted the invitation, as did his protégés Itzhak Perlman, Yo-Yo Ma, Zubin Mehta, and Choliang Lin. It took years to confirm how often fortune led him to the right.
Sample complete. Ready to continue?